Hey, John. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Eldon. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're welcome. Before we start, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. I am Jon White, best known for a YouTube channel called CRECGANFORD, where I discuss myths and mythology. I discuss the stories behind stories. And this allows me to get into depths of religious history, culture, migrations, and how early ancestors thought the meaning of life was.
What do you think? How is culturally significant, or what is cultural significance of a myth or an ancient story?
That's a great starting point to understand what myth is, because you can ask anyone, they'll probably give you different answers. Because most people consider myth to be like a fairy tale, folk tale. It's just a story that has some truth in it, but no one generally identifies what that truth is. But when you restudy myth at an academic level, myth holds a sacred truth, and that is because myths are stories from religions, and religions that are now are no longer practiced. And so all we have left are the stories that these religions told, which we call myths. For example, if no one believed in the Abrahamic gods, the Bible would be considered myth. In fact, you could consider it a myth if you weren't religious. Because we know these stories are sacred or have been sacred, that is why they have persisted, because there has been this sort of truth or belief within it. And even though people no longer practice the religion, that truth persists in the culture and can then turn up in folklore or fairy tales. And so we see culturally myths aren't significant or weren't significant for the culture for a religious reason. But what we find is that the term myth or its meaning really changes through history. So the Greeks had mythos and logos, and mythos were sort of stories of warriors and kings, and logos were more folktale side, were so not necessarily sacred truths, but great stories. Go to the Roman Empire, they start calling the mythos fabulae, more like folktales, and that's how it was, and they're sort of lost to history. And then what we find is quite interesting, that come the late Middle Ages, people rediscover some of these stories and some of these documents. And I think it was Pope Piccolo became a pope, who then discovered Tacitus's work on Germania, which is now a book freely available to everyone, but at the time people had forgotten about it. And in there it showed that the Germanic peoples weren't the barbarians that had been taught for hundreds of years or so since the Roman Empire came about. So the Pope had been pushing this narrative that the Mediterranean cultures, such as the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, these were the cultures from which civilization came. These were the cultures that science came. And then this book came out, and it showed the Germanic people as being not barbarians, but having some social structure. This started to breed nationalism, such as the Eddas in Scandinavia. And what we find is that Germany suddenly thinks, oh yeah, we've got our own history here. And that's where we start getting sort of more of a nationalistic sort of cultural view rather than a religious view of these stories. And that's why they have persisted, in our lifetime and for the last 100 years or so, is more a national pride rather than understanding the religious history and the beliefs and the culture that actually drove those. And what I try and teach is the culture and religious history. I'm not particularly interested in the nationalistic side of things. That sort of adds zero value to me. And that sort of data is useful for understanding migrations of myth, which is quite important if you want to understand their source. But in terms of to enjoy the myth, we really want to understand what was the meaning behind that story. Why are we slaying dragons? Why did we think the world was created like this? Why do we think certain things happen when we die? Why do we die? To me, a myth is a sacred truth from a religious belief that has persisted since prehistoric time of the culture from where that myth came. The Eddas, for example, were written 800 years ago or so. We consider them myth because there was no writing before that, no recorded history for Scandinavia before that. But, for example, for the Greek period, we see writings sort of in the late first millennium BCE, and so prehistory of myth happens sort of before 600 BCE. So the time of myth and prehistory is variable depending on where you start. And that's another important aspect to understand when studying myth and why we sometimes see discrepancies and differences in stories and beliefs. Synopsis is a really good way at understanding what a myth is and why it is important today, and why we've sort of lost the understanding of what it really means. Is a religious story from an older culture. It had nothing to do with what country you live in. Borders were not defined back then. The world was a very different place. And again, that's another very interesting aspect that people don't necessarily understand, that the world was a harder, rougher place, and therefore that also shapes myths. It's the winners of war that tell the stories, not the losers. And so that again affects myth and the things we hear. So to me, that is a good synopsis of what a myth is, and allows us to understand then the sort of questions we need to ask on the importance of myths and the individual myths.
Yeah, thank you. Characters of myths, all the myths across the world, across the geography, do you think, because I do, I believe that, do you think that in some certain time these people were real people?
Defining aspects of myth is that they often do contain gods or demigods, sometimes just heroes who are sons or occasionally daughters of gods. So from that point of view, I do not believe we often see real people in mythologies. Even in the more modern ones, like those in Scandinavia, such as those with Odin or Thor, there has been work done to suggest that real people were sometimes considered possessing the form of the gods. So there is thoughts that, for example, Attila the Hun was a form of Odin. That doesn't mean he was Odin. He may have then inspired some of the later stories about Odin. But this is where we have to do our work and understand the difference between myth and folklore, because Attila is a real person and not a god. Haile Selassie is a very interesting example from Ethiopia, where he basically said, look, I'm not a divine person. But when he died, he became a significant godlike figure for the Rastafarian movement. Royalty are considered gods. We don't necessarily see myths about them. We see stories about them. They're not myths that carry on through the ages. No, I do not believe in a true myth that we see real people personified as gods. However, it is gods are the personification of these spirits who've managed and controlled the world and nature. So we see a really interesting evolution where, for my work anyway, where we see hunter-gatherers start settling into communities. And when you're a hunter-gatherer, you're reliant on the world and nature and weather to influence your environment, influence your stories that you tell. You want to understand why the moon moves or the rivers move or the wind blows. That's the spirits around you. But when we start living in communities, some people are removed from nature and they are then reliant on other people to control their destiny. There's a lot of psychological studies around this too. The larger the community you're in, the more stress the lower echelons of society have, and therefore the more reliant they are on people within the community to live. And so we start seeing these spirits that were wind and the sun and the moon change to be ruled by a personified human-shaped god. Settlements grow into towns, into cities, and so we find that what we consider animistic and shamanistic type cultures turn into the sort of religious belief systems we see in the Near East popping up 4,000 or 5,000 years ago in Babylon and around Mesopotamia, where you see gods like Marduk start to appear. These are human-shaped gods that take on aspects of nature. Is almost like a throwback to the animistic spirits. So the spirit of thunder and lightning, when we were hunter-gatherers, turns into a personified god of storms. We start seeing this evolution and shaping of pantheons. And in effect, if we remove all the man-made aspects of gods, these are probably the key spirits.
I had a hypothesis that, for example, let's say Odin,
Mhm.
20, 30,000 years ago was a man who maybe lost an eye for something, but over thousands and thousands of years, the story that survived and came to us and changed names and languages came to as Odin, who lost his eye for the knowledge.
Mm.
It's my hypothesis. I was just playing with it a lot.
And it's easy to think that, because it's reasonably easy to picture evidence in your mind that allow that situation to happen. For you see a image of a god and you think, that image must be based on a real person. In terms of that name and in terms of what he looks like, is a relatively young god. I mean, Odin probably has not been around more than 2,000 years. Now, that's not to say a god that had Odin's abilities wasn't around, but the name Odin is relatively new, probably stemmed from, to some degree, Othor. And Othor seems to have come from Wothu, which is an early Indo-European word, or Proto-Indo-European word, probably associated with the wild hunt. And then we see writing come into Scandinavian poetry. He had both his eyes. It's only, again, the last 2,000 years and that we see him lose an eye. For me, Odin was not a personification of anyone. However, that's not to say that people didn't influence how they thought. Creation isn't directly from an individual.
I read about creation of myths and, of course, a hero with 1,000 faces.
1,000 faces, yes. Joseph Campbell, yes. I understand where Joseph Campbell was going on also. He's got some very good points, but sometimes his ideas are used incorrectly when studying myth.
What methods are available to us to make a difference between myth and historical fact?
Okay, so something is historical fact. It tends to have been written down in history as a primary source. Myth itself doesn't come from such things. We were being told long before they were written down. I guess the question we want to ask ourselves is, are there any historical facts in myth? And that really depends on each individual myth. Probably a better way to approach this a step back is, what influences myth? Two big aspects that influence myth are the environment and the social construct around the people who are writing the myth. If something big happens in your environment or something big happens within your society, then myths often change to reflect that. And we see that because we can see myths change and alter over time. The dragon's a very good example of that, how it started off as a life-giving animal and ended up stealing princesses. And we can sort of track how society has changed, but there's other aspects of that. You could argue that if an environmental event or a social event has influenced myth, they do contain some historical data. These are told in prehistory. We can't necessarily guarantee what they were talking about. We see examples of this, let's say volcanic eruptions in Scandinavia, and they had a really cold period of time in the early first millennium. And while we know that happened, and we see certain stories maybe have come from that, such as the Ragnarok and the end of the world and the cold winter of a few years, the myth doesn't specifically state historical fact. In Greece and Rome, myth is losing some of its religious aspects. Socrates and Plato pushing back against myth, and religion. Myths are older than the historical aspects in them. There was a first flood myth. Flood myths or floods are prevalent. When a society gets a version of a flood myth told to them, they can apply it to their own society and their own environment. And so it changes, and their floods then could be linked to their own environment rather than the earlier one. The flood myth started long before the last ice age. Myths can pick up historical facts, especially where they're related to environment and society. Myths will change and replace those where necessary as environment and society changes.
How do we analyze the evolution of myths across different cultures, time periods?
To understand where a myth comes from, we have a number of tools at our disposal, and we tend to group them in a process called phylogenetics. And this allows us to take data from a number of different aspects of anthropology and create a map of probability. For example, we understand how DNA works, and so we can see how people have migrated by tracing DNA. We can understand how language works, and we can understand how language has migrated through these rules. And so if we apply language dispersal on top of DNA dispersal, we can often see a correlation that language tends to follow. People don't turn up somewhere and then start a brand new language. They take language with them and it evolves separately from where they came from. We collect all this data for archaeological information, DNA and linguistic information, and then we collect myth information. And that's the hardest part. To collect reliable information on stories is a challenge because the less and less data there is to collect that is reliable, because stories change. We collect as much data from as many stories on the subject that we're interested in finding out about in the myth, and then throw that data, certain key parts of the story, in the mix with all this other data. And so that data in terms of myth, would include, what subjects are they talking about, who are the key characters, what are the key things that happened, those sorts of things. So if we talk about dragon slaying, what did a dragon look like? How many heads did he have? How many legs? How many eyes? Was he a particular colour? What was the name of the warrior that defeated him? But then what we also do is we take sort of particular lines of myth that seem key and take those, because what we find is that whilst myth does change in environments and society, that certain key lines of myth will always be maintained, and certainly the overall structure and plot of a myth, because it is a sacred truth. That's the real core of it. With all this data, we understand particular lines and words used, we understand the certain key aspects of the myth, and we put that along with where we see people have dispersed over time. Then we can look at where is the most probable source of the myth. Dragon myths are a really interesting example where we can do that, and we see the myth change. Dragons kidnapping princesses and being slayed by a knight, certainly across Europe. We see earlier forms of dragons holding back water and being killed to give water for the agricultural cultures. But we also see, sort of in between that, dragons stealing cattle, because cattle were more important than agricultural farming for certain cultures. So we can see sort of splits in dragon stories. That then allows us to understand what is the probability of a myth starting, let's say, in England or Persia or India or Africa or Australia. And we can build up a map of where's the most likely point it started. And that's what I tend to talk about when I discuss mythology, is that whilst we can't guarantee anything I am saying to be true, what I can say is what I'm telling you is to be the most probable likelihood of it being true, the most cause and source of that.
So you spoke about dragon myth, and very interesting that it evolves from culture to culture. Saint George that kills a dragon becomes a female, and so on and so forth. But what are the common motives, ideas, themes found in the stories across cultures, across various timelines and so on?
Yeah, this is interesting. I was having a good chat with a philosophy lecturer from Oxford a couple of weeks ago about this, and they were interested in understanding what questions are asked in myth. The question you want to ask, the question is, why are we telling these myths? Because if we understand why we're telling the myths, then we understand the big questions in life. And the fact is that most cultures around the world will have a creation myth, i.e. how did the world come to be? The creation of life and humans. There are often myths about why we are no longer immortal, so why do we die? And there tend to be myths about killing a dragon. And then we see sort of other consistent myths around that, to a degree, about going to visit the dead, going to the underworld, or flood myths. But these tend to be myths that build on existing aspects of other myths. Why is the world shaped as it is? Why are we on it? And why are there bad things happening to me, and how do I stop them? If you think about it, that's life.
So how do we interpret the symbolism in myths? For example, symbol of moon or a sun means something different today, but it was 10,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. How do we know exactly what they meant in the different timelines?
That's a really good point. If I read the Poetic Edda from Scandinavia, but I read it in Old Norse, then I would probably understand it slightly differently and get different meanings from it than if I read a English translation of it. And that's because certain metaphors and similes just are lost in translation, or we don't know them. There must be jokes told in Norway and Sweden that an English person wouldn't understand. So yes, it is a challenge. And so what we have to do is we have to understand, as many myths as we can from that culture. And where those myths refer to this object time and time again, we can build up a better understanding of what that really meant. We can understand certain gods and goddesses are aligned to certain aspects of the environment, such as, let's say, the sea or storms, sun, the moon. And in other cultures, it's not so clear.
You spoke about languages, and I did some readings about Indo-European languages, and languages aren't bound by national borders. Languages are alive, and they spread the words from one language to another, and it's fluid. For example, English language, all military, governmental, and ruling words came from Norman French when William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066. But also Norman French comes from the Norse.
Yeah, absolutely. English is the most changed language I know because of the influence of the Viking and the French raids and Roman conquest. Britain is a huge mix of cultural influence.
My point was, I kind of lost my point, but I saw your video about languages, and I found it very interesting how we can find the oldest words that in languages.
Preserved words, yes. So words that are preserved through time. And there are not many of them. And so we find words that aren't used much disappear or change quickly. Words that are used all the time persist. And I think there are about 20 or so words. And some of them are, I guess, obvious, like the I, you, me. But then there are a few less obvious ones being ancestor to Indo-European languages. The real odd words on there were bark and ash, or ashes, like as in fire ashes, and bark as in tree bark, and worm. But worm back then could have meant snake or serpent. But probably the oldest word we know of all, older than any of them, is probably one, the number one. That is probably the oldest word we can trace back with reasonable confidence that has been sort of maybe 25 to 30,000 years old. Luckily for us, we can put that sort of date on a number of things, language and myth, because there was a migration into North America from Siberia at the last glacial maximum, which is about between 18 and 24,000 years ago. If any aspects of language or myth are found in the First Nation American settlements that also appear in Siberia, we can have some confidence to say that they migrated at the time of their glacial maximum, because there was minimal contact between those cultures before the Europe colonized the Americas. That's why when we see the language of North American peoples and Siberians and European languages and make sort of the assessment that these are similar, cognates or etymologically the same, myths which have similar plots, these things are pre-glacial maximum. Hopefully I can produce some papers in the coming, or even a book or two in the coming years, to help add further insight into these older mythologies that we know are older than 20,000 years.
Speaking of your book, then I will definitely buy your book, and I will definitely promote your book if you say yes to another of these dialogues. You wanted to say yes.
Yeah, well, when the book comes out.
You spoke about migration, and I wanted to ask you, what is the influence of migration and maybe even some kind of a cultural exchange between ancient people when they met, or how did they spread their myths? I'm fascinated, and I want to know how these structures in oral traditions change myths over time.
So the first one is, why did we tell stories, and how can stories migrate from 30,000 years ago? There weren't too many humans around. How did those stories persist? That sort of means that every time groups of humans came across each other, they told stories, because that wouldn't have happened too often. Well, you could either kill that other group of humans, or you befriend with them and exchange information with them. I would like to think the humans of 30,000 years ago, they were reasonably friendly social groups of people who spread stories and liked telling stories. And from that, we can assume many things, such as, the language was reasonably proficient at that time, and some of the myths were already entrenched in our lives. These stories about dragons and creation of the world and alike and death were all already being told and established. That's one aspect to consider, and that really fascinates me, and I don't think enough is spoken about that or really understood about that. I think that's a really good message to send out. When these early humans came across each other, they sat down and told stories and exchanged ideas and the like. The other aspect you say is how did these stories change or develop? We can understand we have an inherent need to tell stories. Why would a story about a creation myth? The earliest creation myths are about the sea. Cosmos was the sea, and then land comes into the sea. How does that work for cultures and for groups of people who've never seen the sea? What you find is that they change that myth to be a flood myth. So the flood myth is really a creation myth retold. And we see things then change because of that. So, for example, the creation myth has in it a earth diver, such as a swan or a duck. It dives down to the bottom of the sea, grabs some mud and brings it to the surface. That turns into land. Land expands and the tree grows on that land and humans come from the tree. 2,500 years ago, we have Noah's Ark, which is the biblical flood myth. And we've already got a creation myth that's happened, but then a flood comes along. There isn't a duck in this flood that goes to the bottom of the sea, but Noah has a dove, and he sends the dove off and it goes off and grabs a bit of land and brings it back to say, oh, land is now here for you. And so we see the myth adapt and change. There's a deep motif there on the earth diver turning into the dove wrapped around a large body of water, destroying the world. The dragon from giving water to holding back water when we needed it. When you have farming, you rely on water to come to you. And when it doesn't come to you, why hasn't it come to you? Well, the dragon was the water giver. So if the dragon isn't giving you water, then the dragon's bad. So we got to create a god to kill the dragon. This defeating of a dragon changed into cattle. The term Dana in Persian, which means who lactate, female cows. When that was taken to India, Dana was very similar to what women meant rather than female cows. And so the story turned from cows being stolen to women being stolen. We get St. George and the Dragon, for example.
It's interesting. I didn't know that. Nowadays, myths are always interpreted and reinterpreted again and again. What we thought of creation myths from Celtic or Slavic or any culture, what are the challenges of reinterpreting them over and over again and determine what they actually meant?
Great question. So the world of academia is an interesting world. Some people may undertake the task purely in their own enclosed environment without outside influence, and some people will use outside influence. This has different outcomes. Poetic Edda of the Old Norse myths, where we see English translations from about 120 years ago, all translating the term Jotun as giant. And that's because they're always looking at each other's work. Jotuns aren't really giants. They're just monstrous beings. They're just a derogatory term for the horrible beings. So that's what Jotuns are. Probably a reference to a previous culture. That's one example where if people reinterpret, reuse existing interpretations to help guide them, we can see the persistence of errors in that. And the Bible's another good one. The Bible starts off as in the beginning God. The Hebrew beginning God's spirit flowed over the deep water. The term spirit is mistranslated. It should mean wind because the term spirit wasn't in use 2,000 years ago. It's more of a modern interpretation of that word. And in the beginning actually means at the start of this story. It's not actually in the beginning. The story's already started, which again then allows a misinterpretation that, oh, God was there before it all began. But that isn't true. What you're doing is you're just not starting a story. The first two lines of the Bible are a synopsis of the Enuma Elish, so the Babylonian creation myth. Very often you see in academia that people highlight all the mistakes rather than concentrate on the good things. There are pros and cons in interpretation and translation. There's a difference between translation and interpretation. I can literally translate something from a different language, but that may not make sense because it contains metaphors or jokes or something like that that don't make sense in the culture I belong to. If you don't do a literal interpretation, then you have to do sort of a narrative interpretation. And so then you may lose some of the meaning of the words in doing that because your understanding of what something was trying to say may not actually be what it was trying to say. Or I've got 10 copies of the Poetic Edda in English on my bookshelf, 10 copies of the Bible, so you can compare.
Here's my 3 last questions. Usually I ask what's the point of art, but we spoke about storytelling. So what is the point of storytelling, and why do we always tell same stories over and over again? From Jesus to Moses to Star Wars, everybody has the same character arc and same challenges in their adventures.
Right, that's a big question. Stories you want to tell, but until recently you tell them because it's part of your religion, part of your belief, and belief was really important to society. Telling stories is what makes us human, and we sometimes don't realise that.
How would you like to be remembered?
Yes, I'd like my children to remember me in a good way, and tell their children about me, because I think that's the one of the main purposes of life, to influence your children. But for the rest of the world, I'd like to be. I teach because I love teaching, and for people who really get what I talk about, hopefully they'll be inspired by the things I teach them, the learning, how older cultures saw the world and some of the good that is in there. If I could make a tiny change to the world to just make it better and happier and more knowledgeable, to be remembered for that would be amazing. I don't think I've done that. There's still time.
If you could have a dinner with somebody that you admire, historical figure, character from a book, whatever, who would it be?
Wow. Oh, that's a tough choice there. There's not one person. If I had to choose one just randomly, I'd like a dinner with Richard Feynman, who's a physicist. Very interesting chap. In a way, I feel like I have some resemblance to his persona, although nowhere near as intelligent and influential as he was. Someone like that. If I could have 5 people at a dinner table, then I'd invite Jesus and really stir up a conversation. To have a cup of tea with God and explain, what are you doing here? This doesn't make sense. I'm pretty sure I'll be drinking on my own if I invited God.
Can you tell us where can we find you?
A YouTube channel called CRECGANFORD, and there is also a database called the Mythology database, which has mythological information as well as a number of books and folk tales online, and that's growing all the time. Close to being one of the largest online resources in the world for mythology and folklore.
Thank you, John, for doing this, and I hope we will discuss your book that you are writing. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much, Jordan.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
This concludes this episode. I want to thank you for joining and listening. I hope we inspired you. I hope you learned something.